such as the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, Behavior Analysis and Practice, the Behavior Analyst, Brain Injury, Behavior Analysis Research and Practice, and the Analysis of Verbal Behavior. Please welcome Dr. Heinicke.
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
You can tell I'm a professor. I was expecting everyone to talk back to me. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I would like to say a big thank you to Four Corners ABBA for inviting me to be the first Dixie Eastridge Memorial speaker today. This topic was near and dear to Dixie's heart, that is expanding our services to include those that have suffered brain injuries. And it's also near and dear to my heart. I was very lucky to know Dixie for 10 years, and she served as my supervisor, my direct supervisor, when I interned at Learning Services, Neurobehavioral Institute of Colorado, and she taught me so many valuable lessons. But honestly, I think the most valuable lesson I learned from her was also the simplest, and that is to just implement the golden rule with your clients every day, every day. And particularly after brain injury, you might be very confused. You might not know why you are where you are. You're wondering where your family members are. You're wondering why some stranger is asking you to take a boatload of medications that you've never been on before. So Dixie really taught me to be a constant and a compassionate person in other people's lives, and that is something I hope to emulate for the rest of my career as a professor, as a supervisor, and clinician. So I am excited and very honored to be the speaker today and to serve in this role and to talk about a topic that I could really talk about for days, but I am timing myself, so there is that. So this is a topic and a subspecialty within behavior analysis that's quite rare. It is kind of the road less traveled, if you will. So I wanted to tell you kind of how I landed here, because there's about 10 to 15 of us in the United States that are doing this work that I know of. And we're a wacky crew. Like every year at the SIG, at ABBA, our SIG meeting, it's like a weird family reunion. So it's always the same 11 people. So I really hope you join us this year. So we would really welcome some fresh blood. So at Western Michigan University, where I was an undergrad, I was a pretty typical psych major. And my intro to ABA was very similar to others. My first practicum setting was implementing EIBI in a one-to-one setting with children with autism. And while I'm super glad that other folks are very passionate about doing that, I felt like kind of a bad person, to be honest, because I wasn't enjoying myself. I never saw myself serving children. I always wanted to serve adults. So being a very flippant 19-year-old, I did what 19-year-olds do, and I just ran over to another major. And I thought, I'm going to be a forensic psychologist. I'm going to be Jodie Foster in Silence of the Lambs. And it took me about 2 days to realize there's no way I could do that. I don't have the stomach for that. So I came running back to the psych department, clawing my way back in, and desperately trying to find a home. And at that point, I was lucky enough to have a learning class with Jim Carr, and he had this optional lecture on graduate school, which I had never considered grad school before. And the last bullet on his slide, and he was talking about all these different applications of ABA, the last bullet said rehabilitation. And to me, it was just this light bulb moment. I started thinking back to some pretty profound moments in my life. Back when I was a 5th grader, my best friend Daniel, that you see here on the cover of Reader's Digest, had a very bad entangled brainstem tumor. And so I saw my best friend lose a lot of his functioning. And then I saw him, basically he had to get life flighted to New York City. No one in Michigan would touch this tumor, not a single surgeon. So Fred Epstein was a famous surgeon in New York City. They life flighted him there. He did the surgery pro bono. Daniel made it. He's doing very well today. But as a 5th grader, you're pretty impressionable, and you're seeing your friends lose skills and then relearn how to eat, how to tie his shoes, how to talk again. Also, right around this same time, I started hanging out a lot with my friends. You're having sleepovers, you're hanging out at their houses. And I started to observe that my friends' relationships with their fathers were very different than my own. And this is a picture of me right around that time. Enjoy the 90s style here. So this is me and my dad. And I finally asked my mom about it. Like, why don't we have that relationship that other people have? And she's like, well, he has a brain injury. And I had no clue. I had to have that normative experience of seeing other people. So my dad suffered a severe traumatic brain injury about 4 years before I was born. He was in a car accident, was ejected from the vehicle. coma for about a month, and he also had to relearn everything all over again. But you can see here, physically, you'd have no clue. But the cognitive, the behavioral, the emotional ramifications of that injury have been lifelong. So now you can see kind of why that was a light bulb moment. And I realized that these profound people in my life, they could have really used some behavioral services. So that's why I have landed in this area. So today I would like to take time to tell you a little bit more about brain injury, get you familiar with this area, talk about what brain injuries are, how often they happen, so their epidemiology, and some of the common causes. After which I would like to tell you kind of where we stand right now as a field when it comes to our research. Can we say what we're doing with this population is evidence-based practice yet? And lastly, for those of you in the room who want to take that road less traveled, it's a difficult one, it's a challenge. So I want to leave you with some strategies of how to diversify your practice. And it doesn't have to be brain injury. These strategies also apply to any other subspecialty like gerontology or OBM or what have you, while remaining an ethical behavior analyst and following the BACB's code. So first of all, let's talk about brain injury. So when you think of brain injury, you likely think of a TBI, a traumatic brain injury, maybe a car accident, or you probably think about football now with the concussion discussion that's been going on in the media the last several years, the movie Concussion. However, you really should be more aware of this term. This is the umbrella term for brain injury. It's ABI, or acquired brain injury. And under this term, this is split out into those traumatic events that we typically think of, and also those non-traumatic events that still impact the brain at the neuronal level. They're still brain injuries. Under that T, we have our traumatic impact injuries. Again, what you typically think about. These are contact injuries, usually struck by or against, where either you're a moving target and you hit something stationary, or you are stationary and something moving hits you. Okay, so these are contact injuries. These are things like assaults, gunshot wounds, falls, and so forth. But you do not need to hit your head on something to suffer a brain injury. We do a lot of crazy activities these days. I sound like an old lady right now. These days, we travel down the highway going 80 miles per hour. You go skiing right outside of this hotel and go very fast down a hill. Our brain really wasn't designed to do those things. So if you're accelerating very quickly and you come to a short stop, but you don't hit your head, you can have an inertial injury where your brain goes forward. Your cerebral spinal fluid can only protect it so much. It goes forward, it hits those kind of bony ridges on the inside of your skull, and it bounces back. So you have a coup-contra-coup injury. Primary source, secondary source of injury. Usually it's frontal lobe, occipital lobe, and oftentimes why you hear survivors complain about vision concerns after an injury. So these are falls where maybe you catch yourself, unlike me, I'm never that quick, and you catch yourself but you don't hit your head. Right? This could also be a motor vehicle accident where you're wearing your seatbelt and you're protected, but you have that whiplash, back and forth motion, and so forth. And then with those non-traumatic events, that was my friend Daniel, that's what he encountered. These include things like strokes. We often see these in the 75 and older population. This could also include infections like meningitis, tumors, and also anoxic events like a near drowning accident or an accidental overdose. Now when it comes to how often these things happen, those causes, the CDC does give us some pretty good data. We have a lot of emergency room data on traumatic brain injury. And right now, falls are actually the #1 cause of a TBI. It was motor vehicle accidents for some time, but now we have a lot more protections in our vehicles. We have laws regarding seatbelt use and helmet use. So now MVAs, motor vehicle accidents, are second, followed by those struck by and against episodes. And here are some additional causes of a TBI. And the frustrating thing about this is a lot of these are preventable. With non-traumatic, here are some additional causes. And again, this is a short list. So aneurysm, prolonged or kind of uncontrolled seizure activity, infections, metabolic disorders, so having type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes and not managing it well, and neurotoxic poisoning such as carbon monoxide poisoning. The scary thing about brain injuries is they can happen to anybody, anyone in this room at any time. One of my past supervisors, one of Dixie's best friends, Mike Mazzoni, my first day on my internship site, he told me, remember this, brain injuries don't discriminate. Doesn't matter how old you are, It doesn't matter your race or ethnicity, your gender, doesn't matter your religion, your socioeconomic status. It can happen to anybody. But they do disproportionately affect a few groups of folks. One of those groups are individuals who are incarcerated either in prison or jail. There's a wide range of articles out there. One says up to 87% of those incarcerated have suffered a brain injury. Also, those in the military are at a risk. Of course, blast injuries are quite common. And right around 20% of the 1.6 million servicemen and women that came back from Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom came back with a TBI. When it comes to gender, there is a split here where men and boys are a little bit more impacted. It's right around a 60-40 split from males to females. In those age ranges, we know those who are quite young, so the 0 to 4 range, are at a little bit more risk, and also those 75 and up. And usually they share a cause of an injury. Does anyone want to guess what it is? Falls. Oh yeah, absolutely. And then we have this beautiful population, the 15 to 24, right? And you can guess why we see some injuries here. This is when you're learning how to drive, your frontal lobes aren't all the way formed yet, and you are making some risky decisions. Now, the prevalence or the incidence of TBI has continued to grow. The second to last CDC report said 1.7 million TBIs sustained per year in just the United States alone. And that's just TBI, and that's just those who went to the ER. That's not ABI, that's not folks who went to their primary care physician, maybe didn't even get treated. A lot of those folks have that old school mentality of just walk it off, you're fine, you're absolutely fine. So this is a large underestimation, but their most recent CDC report says 2.5 million TBIs every year, so that's a really large number. And when you compare brain injury to other conditions that you hear about a little bit more on the news, like major depression, and you compare the numbers for those conditions that cause long-term disability, TBI actually ranks 4th. But when you combine it with stroke, which is just one of the many causes of an ABI, then ABI ranks 2nd to major depression for causing long-term disability in Americans. So this is a public health concern. Now, after a brain injury, this can really change how you think, how you feel, how you act, and also how you relate to those around you, including your own family. So if you look at the brain injury literature, generally the changes afterward, or the consequences, the fancy term that we use is sequela. The sequela are usually broken down into 3 main categories: being physical, also known as sensory motor consequences, cognitive consequences, and behavioral and emotional consequences. I'm just going to show a short list of what someone might experience. In the physical realm, here's a short list. I'm not going to go through all of these. A lot of you know what these terms mean. But imagine being a 24-year-old who got in a car accident and now you do not have control of your bowel or bladder anymore. Think of how that would impact your choices and to reintegrate into the community and be around your friends again. These are really big challenges. And typically with those physical sequelae, when they happen in combination, because usually they don't just happen alone, they can be dangerous. So for example, if a survivor has vision concerns afterward, they have a reduced visual field or double vision, and they're also a little wobbly, they have balance concerns. That puts them at a risk to sustain yet another TBI from a fall. And once you sustain one TBI, you are 3 times as likely to sustain a second. Once you sustain a second, you are 8 times as likely to sustain a third. So it is a dangerous combination. Under the cognitive consequence realm here, by far, survivors report, and also brain injury rehabilitation specialists report, that memory impairments are the most disabling consequence after brain injury. Of course they are. You're relearning information, you have to maintain it, and you also have to generalize it into different settings. Memory impairments are going to make that quite difficult. Also here, something that's quite common is that awareness. So awareness of your own deficits, called anosognosia. This can also be really baffling if you haven't seen it before. And not being aware of your own deficits can put you at a significant safety risk as well. And the behavioral, I don't need to explain any of these to you. You know these very well. You're very intimate with these topographies of problematic behavior. And they can also be experienced by those after a brain injury. And usually the issue here with the behavioral consequences is that they really can limit how someone can achieve their rehabilitation goals, particularly if someone is refusing to even enter into a rehab session or be present and participate when they're there, and that's incredibly common. So these sequelae, like I said, they create barriers. They create major barriers to independent living, to reintegration, to living at home again, and to meeting those rehab goals. And the cost of rehabilitation continues to rise. It absolutely does. And insurance companies want to know how that client is doing. So they're going to be knocking at your door saying, where are the data? And if that client's not performing, simply because they're not going into session, the insurance company's not going to care. They're going to rip that funding right out from that individual, and they're going to decrease their length of stay when that length of stay should not have been decreased. So I think this really opens the door for behavior analysts to really show the utility of what we can do to help out with these sequelae and break down those barriers. And there are plenty of single case design research studies out there evaluating our interventions that we typically use in developmental disabilities and autism services for this population. So next I kind of want to tell you a little bit more about that and summarize for you where is our literature right now. How good of a job are we doing publishing these studies? So the data I'm going to show at this portion of the presentation is from a meta-analysis that I conducted. It was probably the longest year of my life, I will say, if you've ever conducted meta-analysis. It's a lot of detail, for sure. And I thought I wasn't going to find that many studies, but I'll show you how many I found in a moment. And I think every week in lab meetings, like a single tear would run down my cheek. Like, I found another 10. I have to code another 10. And the main point of a meta-analysis is really to figure out, are these interventions considered evidence-based practice? And there are plenty of reviews that have been done on behavioral services and rehab settings, but we wanted to take our review kind of a step further, so I wrote this with my advisor, Jim Carr. We wanted to expand and include both kids and adults using that broader term of ABI, not TBI, so we included everybody that met our definitions. We also wanted to classify our interventions the way we would classify them, and maybe not how a neuropsychologist would classify them. So we used the chapter structure of Cooper, Heron, and Heward, because it is the most common textbook in our graduate training programs, to come up with our intervention categories. We coded for the first time for the use of functional assessment, and then we calculated effect sizes for every single evaluation and ran every single evaluation through 2 different evidence-based practice frameworks, one is for psychology, so APA Division 12, which I'll talk about today, and we also ran them through special education guidelines from Horner and colleagues as well. So to identify these articles, we did a massive search. It took quite an amount of time. So we used PsycInfo and the like, these databases here, to find our articles using the following key terms. So we used either brain injury or head injury in combination with all these terms listed here on the right. And from this initial search, I found just over 1,400 articles. You can see where the tears started to flow. But then I had the joy of reading every single abstract and trying to figure out, was this behavior analytic or was it not? And those that weren't, just from reading the abstract, it was pretty clear if they were not, and you would toss those out. So after tossing those out, I ended up with 140 studies to do a careful analysis on. From those, I cut out about 58 for a variety of reasons. And the most common reason, I have to admit, was kind of a bummer for me, and that is right here, so insufficient baseline data. So in order to calculate an effect size, you have to have enough data to do so. So we set our bar pretty darn low. We set it at just 2 baseline data points needed to calculate those sizes. And we had to cut out 29 studies for not at least having 2 baseline data points. So very limited use of repeated measurement. That was a bummer for me. With the 82 studies that we kept from the 140, we also found an additional 24 after doing table of content searches for our major journals, so JABA, BMA, Behavioral Interventions, Brain Injury, and Journal of Head Trauma Rehab. And then we also did ancestral searches of every single article we found. So we read through every single reference section to see if we missed anything, and we missed 6. So a grand total here of 112 studies with 224 participants. What we ended up finding here after a lengthy coding process is the publications were pretty low and variable over time, right around 4 or so published each year. And they were published in over 22 different journals, so this is just a short list, a lot outside of ABA. But the main players here were the journal Brain Injury, followed by Behavioral Interventions, and then JAVA. When it comes to who was included, we found that the majority of participants in these studies were adult males. We also found that their time-sense injury, which is a really important participant characteristic to report in studies, was only reported in 78% of those studies, and their range was just wild. So 12 days post-injury up to 22 years post-injury, with an average of right around 4.5 years. And the cause of injury was reported in the majority of studies, both for those suffering a traumatic brain injury and non-traumatic injury. And when it comes to how many suffered those injuries, the majority here suffered a TBI versus those non-traumatic injuries. Now, when I started out on this journey, I thought for sure that I was going to have to write kind of a two-part review. I thought the way that oftentimes rehab specialists view us and view our field is we're the problem behavior people, right? Problem behavior is happening in PT, you're going to come in and you're going to fix it for me. So I thought that we were going to find a lot of reduction studies, problem behavior reduction studies. So I thought I'm going to do a quantitative analysis of those. And the acquisition stuff, the reteaching behavior, I thought probably not going to find a lot. I'll do a narrative of those. But it happened to not be the case. So I did find a lot more, some more reduction studies, but there were a lot of acquisition studies too, and that was an exciting finding for me, because of course we do more than just reduce problem behavior. We're pretty darn good at teaching skills, and we're also pretty darn good at reteaching skills. In terms of the target behaviors in those acquisition studies, so the reteaching studies, they really varied. They varied quite a bit, and these are the top three. So reteaching academic skills, followed by compliance with academic skills, and then social skills. Very critical for getting by if you're going back to school. And with the behavior reduction studies, we found something interesting there as well. There were three main topographies that made up half of the topography studies. And it's funny because these are exactly what you would think of when you think of someone struggling in rehabilitation. So inappropriate vocalizations, yelling at your therapist, right? PT, I had a client once tell me, PT, it's not physical therapy, it's pain and torture. Well, I see your point. Aggression toward others, family members, staff members, other clients, and disruptive behavior. Typically, this is your refusal behavior, refusal to enter into a rehab session, to participate. And that can make things, of course, very challenging. In terms of the research designs used, we did find that the multiple baseline design was the most commonly reported design, followed by the reversal, and then again, this was another bummer finding for me. The third most common design was an A-B design, or a non-experimental design. And when you're running these evaluations through those evidence-based practice frameworks, you need to say that you've demonstrated experimental control. And we all know that you cannot do that in an A-B design, right? So all of those evaluations had to get thrown out, and that was the most common reason why we had to kick those out through the evidence-based practice portion of this analysis. But you can think of why, right? It makes sense why people are using A-B designs in your rehab settings. I don't think insurance companies would be very happy if you did a reversal. That's a lot of money. Rehab is extremely expensive. Family members probably are also going to be happy if you do a reversal. And usually it's not just that one target behavior that's being managed. It is multiple behaviors that are being targeted at one time. So of course, this is going to be a common design, but it is a bummer when it comes to evaluating our interventions and saying that they're evidence-based. We also coded for that use of functional assessment, and sadly, and this is just the reduction studies here, we found that most studies, oops, sorry about that, coming back, there we go. All right, we did find that most studies did not report using functional assessment before designing interventions to reduce problem behavior. And those that did reported using one type of assessment, some reported two. The most common assessment was descriptive assessment, so ABC observations, conditional probability analyses, followed by the FA. And for those who actually went through that process, they did report, in the majority of cases, identifying a single function. And can you guess what the modal function was? Escape. Yes, of course, it's escape. Not too big of a surprise. And that also lines up with similar reviews conducted with those with developmental disabilities, with escape being a really common function that we see that is keeping problem behavior going. Now, of course, the main reason why we spend time doing these analyses is to identify which treatments right now can be considered well established, and which ones are new and upcoming and promising, and which ones are still considered experimental. So next I'd like to talk about how we ran these through those evidence-based practice standards. So we conducted effect sizes for every single evaluation, so for 224 evaluations. And we did this by using Rabbit Graph Digitizer software. Have any of you used similar software? Okay, a few of you. For those of you who haven't, what you do is you take a snapshot from your PDF of the article of that graph. You're going to try to do it really clear. You're going to upload it into this software, and you're going to tell the software where your axes are and the range of those axes. And then you have the really fun process of clicking every single data point to then pump out data into an Excel file for you to then conduct all of your analyses. So if you're ever having a bad day, just think about being one of my research assistants for this project. I bought them so much coffee and so many donuts because I felt terrible for them. So this was a long process. So we had data for every single study, and we calculated 3 different effect sizes. So we calculated, similar to Cohen's d, is standard mean difference scores, percentage of non-overlapping data, and also tau non-overlap, which at the time was a pretty new effect size measure. Now is becoming a little bit more familiar. I'm not going to bore you with these. I'm just going to show you one for a very basic evaluation. So I'll show you standard mean difference. So how you go about calculating this effect size is this is just 2 phases, so very easy peasy. And this here we're looking at a reduction study. So you would take the average of your intervention data, you would subtract it from the average of your baseline, and then you would divide that by the standard deviation of your baseline, and that spits out an effect size. Now, each one of these effect sizes is evaluated and looked at a little differently and interpreted differently. This is very similar to Cohen's d. So how we interpret SMD scores is right around a 0.2 is small, right around a 0.5 or so, medium effect size, and a 0.8 or above is considered large. Okay, so that's what we were working with. Now, again, we did run these through 2 different frameworks. I'm only going to talk about the APA Division 12. What we had to do is determine, is every single evaluation, was it effective? Okay, did it have efficacy? So was the intervention more effective than no intervention, or if it was compared to another intervention, was it more effective? And did the authors use a convincing experimental design? So ABAB designs with at least 3 demonstrations, multiple baseline designs with at least 3 panels or 3 demonstrations, and so forth. We also had to code for the treatment. Was it manualized? And oftentimes in ABA, it's not manualized. So did the authors describe it in enough detail, enough technological detail that someone else could pick up that article and replicate it tomorrow? We also looked at the participants and how they were described. You need to do this in a very technological way as well. That's how our field operates and how we build lines of research. We describe our participants very carefully when we replicate. And here we basically decided that folks had to report age, gender, time since injury, and type of injury to be included. If they forgot any of those big ones, then they were kind of sloughed off. And then intervention effectiveness according to quantitative analysis. So here we set the bar, fairly low, at a 0.5 or above according to SMD scores. Now, an intervention category was considered well established if 9 studies met those criteria, so every evaluation in that study met those criteria, with at least 2 of those studies being conducted across separate labs, different geographic locations. If only 3 to 8 met, then we consider that to be probably efficacious. And under 3, that would be considered an experimental intervention. So here is what we found. I know this is small, so I'm going to walk you through it. So here on the left, you have your intervention categories that are listed out. Again, we use the chapter structure of Cooper-Hewitt and Hewitt. So you have things like reinforcement, group contingencies, chaining, direct instruction, and so forth. In this column here, we have the number of studies that were ran through this analysis, and in parentheses, the number of evaluations or participants. And then right next to it, the number that then met those criteria that we set. With those SMD scores, again, I said 0.5 or above is what we were looking at. 0.8 or above is strong. We found enormous effect sizes for what we do. Enormous effect sizes. However, when it came to those categories, what we ended up finding is for skill acquisition, these are just the acquisition categories, reinforcement and antecedent manipulations had enough quality data to say they're well supported. That's it. After that, self-management is considered probably efficacious. And the remainder of those intervention categories that may well be very effective for this population just didn't have the data. A lot more research needs to be done. They're right now considered experimental therapies. We did see a little bit better of an outcome here with behavior reduction studies. So you had those intervention categories. Also, those SMD scores were quite large, not as large as we saw in the acquisition studies, but still quite large. And here we had 3 interventions that are now considered well established. So that is differential reinforcement, antecedent manipulations, and punishment, with self-management and extinction being probably efficacious, leaving contingency contracting and group contingencies as experimental therapies. Okay, so a little bit better of a story than the skill acquisition side. Now, when it comes to why these studies were thrown out of our analysis, really what we found is we have some complications with methodological rigor over time, right? So one thing that we did find that I've mentioned is very limited technological descriptions of participants, of the settings in which these experiments were carried out, and also the dependent variables too, which is a pretty big bummer. We found, again, the limited use of repeated measurement, so a lot of studies were thrown out because they just didn't have the baseline data to have a good comparison with their intervention data. But again, you can see why that is, right? In a neuro rehab setting where you have insurance companies looking at you, you're going to want to move out of baseline as soon as you can. So I can see why this is the case. We also found that overall authors did a really good job with calculating and reporting IOA. They did a really good job. But when it came to procedural integrity, maintenance, and social validity data, not so good, not so good. And Horner's guidelines for special education are way more strict than APA's. So in running them through that system, we only came out with about 3 studies that met criteria overall out of 112. 3. Because they also account for social validity, maintenance, and so forth, and we just didn't have the data in these studies. And of course, those common uses of non-experimental designs were another big reason why we had to throw things out. And the work that we were throwing out, it was a bummer because it was really important, and a lot of the problem behaviors or skill acquisition targets were very, very interesting and critical, but we had to toss them out. So overall, what we wanted to do with this is try to give researchers some direction in this area. We have a lot of clinicians out there who want to do research, and we also really need to build this research base, right? So we wanted to give them some recommendations. The first of which is pretty obvious, and that one is, hey, we need to use experimental designs, but maybe don't use the concurrent multiple baseline. Don't use the ABAB. That's not going to work in a practical setting. It's just too complicated. So instead, use designs that are a little bit more amenable to practice. One of those being the alternating treatments design. That's much more amenable to practice. Or a non-concurrent multiple baseline design. So if a clinician has a client with a very unique problem behavior and they implement an intervention and collect data very carefully as they should, you can then set that data set aside. And the next time you have a client who exhibits similar characteristics, run that intervention again, but just extend that baseline by a little bit. Do that a third time. Then stack those AB graphs, and now you have a non-concurrent multiple baseline design. So hopefully these recommendations are followed, but practical settings in doing research, that's a huge challenge in and of itself. We also really recommend to just increase the quality across all dimensions, so make sure that you're pulling someone in to measure IOA for you, to get those treatment integrity data. Make sure you're throwing in some sort of measure with the family or maybe even staff about the acceptability of your treatment, that social validity. Make sure you're trying to get maintenance data if possible. And lastly, our big push is just for researchers or clinicians who are interested in doing research in their settings to really focus on those areas where we just don't have the data yet. So that is these areas here for behavior reduction, so group contingencies and contingency contracting. And then all of these suckers here, we have a lot of work to do. So all of these skill acquisition categories, so group contingency, fluency training, chaining, token economy, contingency contracts, direct instruction, imitation, shaping. And a lot of these you'll see down at the bottom, there's just no evaluation of these procedures. So any research at this point in time would be very helpful to our case. And really why this matters so much. I know this is a lot of data mining and it was not the most exciting project to embark on, but the results were very important. In evidence-based practice, it matters. It absolutely matters. Insurance companies are looking at different things over time. They are changing very quickly. It's hard to keep up. For those of you in autism, yeah, it's really hard to keep up. In brain injury settings, those funding sources, they're not as well carved out as they are in autism and developmental disabilities. And we're also interfacing as behavior analysts in these settings with a bunch of other professionals that Jeff Kupfer was mentioning earlier. So PTs, OTs, speech language, physiatrists, psychologists, psychiatrists, the list goes on, nurses. And we need to have a leg to stand on when we're talking to these folks to show that what we're doing is important and it works. So that's why it matters. So hopefully, when I rerun this analysis, when 10 years have gone by, and those poor future research assistants, right, and I pull them into this again, I really hope to see a little bit better of an outcome. So next, if you are thinking in the back of your head that maybe you want to diversify your practice, I want to give you some strategies for doing so because it is the road less traveled. Whenever I think about kind of choosing what path you're going to go down, I think of a picture like this, right? At ABA right now, and this is what I think of. I think autism down the center, people have done an amazing job, and we can thank those folks for carving this lane out for us as behavior analysts. We now understand the funding streams. There's a strong advocacy organization for autism, several actually, keeping us going, keeping us together. We also have general developmental disabilities over here, pretty well carved out. And then I think of brain injury. And I think of it a little bit more like this, but in reality it felt a whole bunch more like this when I was going down that path. Here we don't have a good understanding of funding streams for behavior analysts. We often have to bundle bill and then have a neuropsychologist sign off for us. So it's an interesting way of funding. We also know that training and getting supervision in this area is much more challenging. That's much more challenging. I had to move, and I uprooted from Michigan and moved to the middle of the Ozarks in Arkansas to get some training from Mike Mazzoni. And then I moved my hind end again from Auburn, Alabama to Lakewood, Colorado. That was a nice move, by the way. I did not want to go back. I cried a little bit on that plane ride. Oh, it's just beautiful here. But I moved to there to work with Mike again and Dixie Eastridge. So training is not easy to come by. When going back to Alabama, I commuted every Friday 3 hours and 3 hours back to a clinic up in Birmingham so I could get this experience and accrue my hours. An additional factor here is, of course, jobs, right? You're saying if I put all that time in to getting that training, if I move, if I put in the effort, can I get a job? And right now, yes, there are jobs out there in brain injury, and I have search settings set up, and I get those alerts kind of once a week from ABA, and they are coming. It is happening. But they might not be in your backyard, right? A lot of these neuro rehab settings, they're in bizarre places, like the middle of the Ozarks. And that's not meant for everybody, right? It's not meant for me. I'm a Michigander. I have German skin. Like, I am not meant for hot weather and large bugs. So in a lot of cases, you have to be a little bit more flexible. You have to be an entrepreneur if you're going to diversify your practice. And believe me, it doesn't come easily to me. Sometimes I always felt like I don't want to be a used car salesman, but you just find a way with your own personal style to really market your services. So it's not well cut out. It is the road less traveled. So because we know this is very effortful, and that's often why a lot of folks stick to those other paths, not saying that's the only reason, because a lot of us absolutely love serving those with developmental disabilities and autism, but we know this is effortful. So Linda LeBlanc and John Baker, who is a behavioral gerontologist, right now he's at Western Michigan University. If you ever have the chance to listen to him speak on gerontology at a conference, do so. He's an amazing speaker. Same with Linda, amazing speaker. But we wanted to write this paper about what it takes to diversify. We wanted to give strategies, specific strategies. Throughout this paper, we use brain injury and we use gerontology as examples, but this can really apply to any of those subspecialties. It could apply to juvenile delinquency or OBM, or it could apply to applications of ABA in sports. So this paper, pick it up and read it. This is linked on my website, so you can get on there and find it. But we tried to do some of the legwork for you. That was our goal. The good news is, even though it can seem really overwhelming, it really can seem overwhelming to diversify, you can use a lot of what you already know. You've been trained well in developmental disabilities and autism. If that's the field you're in, you've been trained very well. And you can transfer that toolkit. So what you know about teaching new skills also applies to reteaching skills. What you know about functional assessment, you can do it with this population too, and do it very successfully and have really quality interventions. So looking at that research, there have been some really cool things done. So you all know of stimulus equivalence. You might use that in your programming for children with autism. That's been used with adults with brain injury to reteach name-based recognition tasks for family members who they have forgotten, right, or staff members. Direct instruction and fluency training have been used to reteach math and reading skills to little kids and adolescents and high schoolers following brain injury. Self-management has been used very successfully to teach vocational skills and return to work skills. And chaining has also been used to reteach hygiene-related skills, so how to shower again, how to get dressed again, how I should take my medications in the morning and get ready and groom myself to walk out the door. So what you know, you can use. Also, when it comes to functional assessment, same story here. Functional analyses have been conducted for all of these topographies of problem behavior very successfully, and then function-based interventions developed and implemented with success. So your toolkit is transferable. However, there are of course some things that you need to know, right? There's legwork that you need to do. So we broke down this paper into kind of two different portions. We broke it down into task one, developing your new competence, right? Following the BACB's guidelines and doing so. And then step two, after you do that, how in the world do you land a job? So first I want to talk a little bit about task one here. Within these tasks, we have listed out strategies. But again, why developing that competence is so important is our ethical guidelines, right? The Professional and Ethical Compliance Code from the BACB. It tells us that we cannot do just what we want to do, right? You need to have confidence before you serve other populations, and this might require some additional training, supervision, and some oversight, or maybe even some consultation as well. And you have to get familiar with a new literature base. 1.03 also says, once you are familiar and you've gained that confidence, you need to maintain it over time. So just like you listen to Tyra Seller's amazing talk, right? You've got a supervision CEU. You need to maintain that knowledge of ABA over time as well, meaning oftentimes you need to go to conferences outside of ABA and listen to those folks as well. And accepting clients, very similar story here to 1.02. If you accept a client with a brain injury, you best be prepared to serve them. So you need to have that education, that consultation, that training. So these are the strategies that, as a group, John and Linda and I came up with. Contacting the literature, contacting relevant and new professional groups, pursuing retraining and supervision, and identifying other professional credentials that may exist for that sub-area outside of ABA. Due to time today, I just want to talk about these first two. The others are laid out in the paper. With contacting the literature, a lot of you have amazing strategies for doing this already, so I'm not going to talk much about this. But to find these articles outside of the typical avenues, you can get on JAVA's website or Behavioral Interventions website or what have you, and search those terms, such as brain injury. Use broad terms. See what comes up. Read those papers. You might also conduct some nice searches on PsycInfo or other similar databases and use, again, those broader terms: behavior analysis, head injury, behavior analysis, brain injury. Also, in our handbook of applied behavior analysis, there's some amazing chapters in that book about other areas, and brain injury is included. And some articles, or some journals rather, have published special issues on these unique areas. Behavioral Interventions has actually published 2 special issues related to traumatic brain injury, so that would be a good issue to pick up and read. And also, if you're a member of our practice organization, APBA, they're a great organization. They do have some member-only resources. They're secret little resources. And one of those is a nice list of references that me and Linda and Mike Mazzoni recommend that you read in brain injury. But there are a bunch of other lists too, such as for OBM and gerontology. So if you have not become a member, this is a great group to join and kind of reap those membership benefits. Now, outside of ABA, because I did say 22 journals is my meta-analysis, right? Not all of them were behavior analytic. The majority actually were not. So you need to contact those additional journals. You need to subscribe to those and read them. In brain injury, if you're interested, my favorite two are Journal of Head Trauma Rehab and Brain Injury that you see here. And gain familiarity and read articles that aren't just behavior analytic, because you're also going to need to pick up more technical language from that new field as well. You can also check out national organization websites for handbooks, manuals, and guides, like the OBM Network, for example. In ABI and brain injury, we have the Brain Injury Association of America, the BIAA. They're an amazing advocacy organization, and they have this book called The Essential Brain Injury Guide. This is used for preparation for the Brain Injury Specialist Credential. And this is a brand new book this last year. They have version 5.0 that just came out. This is a lot of what you need to know about brain injury. This is a great resource to pick up if you're interested. So outside of contacting the literature, you also need to get familiar with new groups, right? So I mentioned the BIAA. There's also the American Congress of Rehabilitation Medicine within brain injury and the North American Brain Injury Society, or NABIS. You have to get familiar with these new groups too. And memberships within these organizations give you a lot of benefits. So beyond getting probably cheaper subscriptions to journals and mailing lists and things like that, you can contact research topics and get ideas for topics that are valuable to other professionals as well. It can help you identify some funding opportunities and networking opportunities too. Within our behavior analysis conferences, we are seeing more of a push to get some brain injury stuff out there. Just this year at ABAI in May, I know that there is going to be a workshop on behavior analysis in neuro rehab settings. There's a panel discussion on the topic, and there's at least one symposia, so please come and give us an audience of more than 11 people. I would really appreciate it. And also join our SIG and come to our SIG meeting. Like I said, it's a wacky group of folks, but they're all amazing individuals. We would love some new folks too. And of course, attend those conferences, like I mentioned. So ACRN has a conference every year. NABIS has a conference every year. I will never forget going to my first NABIS. There were 2 behavior analysts in the audience, and it was me and it was Dixie. That was it. It was just us. And it was nerve-wracking, and there were some folks there that weren't very amenable to behavioral services. They had had bad experiences in the past, right? So we have to make up ground. Dixie was there representing learning services, and I was there representing my university. But it was nerve-wracking, but I also learned so much and made some great connections while I was there. So what's task 2? After you become confident, what do you do next? This involves a lot of flexibility and a lot of creativity. So here are strategies for task 2, but really the main theme throughout these strategies is just maintaining your professionalism in every interaction you have, outside and within behavior analysis. First of all, in doing that, you need to start moderating your language a little bit. And Pat Fryman has an amazing talk on this that he gave at CalAva last year. If you ever get a chance to see him talk about this topic of when and when not to use our technical language, go and watch it. He's amazing. But we really recommend that you develop colloquial descriptions for what we do. Behavior analysts, we're a passionate group of people, and I love being part of it. But we have this deep-seated need, this urge to just teach everybody about the science of behavior, even if they want to listen or they don't want to listen. And we use all of our technical terms, but that's not the time. right? That is not the time. It can come off very off-putting, egotistical. That's not the way we want to come off and spread the word of what we're doing. So those colloquial descriptions and dropping the jargon, like Bailey and Birch talk about in their amazing book, 25 Essential Skills, it's good to drop that sometimes. You only pick it up when you need to. So develop audience control, basically, is this skill. However, you are going to need to learn a new technical set of language. That is, there are some terms I threw out today, the term sequela. You should know what that means. You should know the difference between a traumatic and a non-traumatic injury. You should know what shunt failure looks like in someone with hydrocephalus after brain injury. There are some new things you need to know, because if you don't, it may demean your credibility within a new group of professionals. With employment options, like I said, if you're lucky, you might live in an area where there's a neuro rehab setting, a post-acute setting. But a lot of us don't. Right? A lot of us don't live there. In Sacramento, I don't have that option either. There's nothing there. So because of my personal constraints of I'm going to stay in Sacramento, I'm wedded to the area, that's where I want to stay. And some of you may have those constraints too. Maybe you have aging parents, you need to stay in that area. Right? Maybe your partner has an amazing job that they're not willing to leave. You need to stay in that area. In that case, you're probably more likely to go the consultation route. And you're probably going to consult with a variety of folks too. And in doing that, you have to create new opportunities. So that's when you market yourself and you have to become an entrepreneur, right? You can do this in a couple of different ways. One way you can do this is going into an organization that is behavior analytic, but they're probably serving populations like developmental disabilities and autism. But you can go in, talk to folks and say, would you consider expanding your consumer base to include those with brain injury? I have the specialization. I would love to help your company do that. Right? That's a consultation opportunity that might then lead to a direct employment opportunity down the road. The other opportunity that you can take is find a center or an agency that is providing services to your target group, but those services are not behavior analytic. In Sacramento, I'm working on this right now. We have a day treatment program for adult brain injury survivors from Easter Seals. So I'm going in, I'm giving them some free workshops, I'm doing some pro bono work, involving my students, and opening that door. So hopefully later they hire some of my students and we can get that going. But it does take some flexibility. And Linda LeBlanc did write an amazing paper on this. She used that same strategy in Kalamazoo to open up some positions for behavioral gerontologists where they didn't exist prior to her arrival. So if you want some of those strategies, this is a great paper to read as well. And lastly, marketing your services. Again, remember that other interdisciplinary team members, they are just as passionate about what they do and their philosophies as we are about ours. I don't know how many times I can say that. It's helped me a lot. I want to teach them about what I do. They might not want to hear it. They might want to teach me about what they do. We are equally passionate, right? So even though you might want to come in with your fancy pants line graphs, right? And you love them and you want to describe them and teach people how to read them. It might not be the time, right? It might not, read the audience. It might not be the time. This may be a case where you bring in some simpler pie charts to illustrate what you found, right? So again, moderate, use your audience. And you might have to do some of that pro bono stuff, but I'm telling you, it oftentimes pays off. It really does. So offer to give some free workshops, right? Offer to have some teaching opportunities for staff. Use appealing terms when you do so. And also, try to focus on the stuff that maybe you're not as interested in, it's not your passion, but it would have an immediate benefit to the agency or the consumers, like teaching folks low-effort strategies to reduce problem behavior during caregiving, or low-effort strategies to increase engagement and quality of life. Agencies want to hear about that. So use what you can do and help them solve those problems first and get your foot in the door. Now, what I really hope that you gain from this talk is that this population is fantastic. It is absolutely fantastic. And I love serving individuals with brain injuries. If you like novelty, this is your population. Every brain injury is so dramatically different. It keeps you on your toes as a clinician, and I find that really exciting and really fulfilling as well. And there are a lot of folks out there that need you. Like I said, that incidence, it is on the rise. It used to be 1.7 million. Latest CDC report says 2.5 million, and we know that's an underrepresented sample. But the good news is the number of behavior analysts is also growing every single year, right? Every time Jim Carr presents the VACB's data at conferences, I'm amazed at how rapidly our field is growing, and it's a really exciting time. And if you have been trained in DD or autism, you do have a toolkit that is directly transferable, and you can expand your services. So I'm going to leave you with one of my favorite quotes from Robert Frost's poem. So two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. And I really hope that you join me in choosing the road less traveled. Thank you. I bet we have a couple moments for questions, but I'll